Do you know that there's a weakness in the Army leadership development model, and it threatens the next generation of Army leaders and their ability to be innovative and to dominate the modern battlefield? Do you know that there was recently conducted research that proves that these faults can be addressed if given sufficient time and resources? Stay tuned, for that's what we'll be talking about on this episode of The Evolving Warfighter. Good day, my name is Dr. Franklin Annis. Today I'm going to speak to you about some research I conducted while I was a doctoral candidate at North Central University. While this will be a lengthy video, it does contain very detailed information about the definitions of self-development, some practical applications of self-development, and ways we can integrate self-development into officer-producing programs. Those of you that stay with me throughout this lecture will be rewarded with some practical guidance on how to conduct self-development to improve your own leadership or to mentor junior soldiers on how to become better warfighters. What made me want to study self-development? Well, I, like many other doctoral students, looked around and thought to themselves, what's an easy way to conduct a study and find something valuable so I can finally finish my degree? One thought that immediately came to mind is my experiences as an ROTC instructor. I often found myself in a position where I had to give advice to cadets in terms of self-development, but I didn't really have any good resources. Most of the guidance that had been given to me was rather vague, and I thought to myself I'd just do a simple survey of senior officers, collect a whole bunch of practical advice on how to conduct self-development, throw it together in a manual, and be done with my dissertation. However, along the way, I found that the reason why these types of resources haven't been created is there is much confusion about the definition and application of self-development in the Army. It is rather unfortunate given the strategic importance of the skill of self-development on the modern battlefield. The Department of Army pamphlet 350-58 presents the Army Leadership Development Model. This pamphlet was published in 1994 and revised in 2013. I believe the graphic image used to explain the theory of the Army Leadership Development Model, published in the 1994 edition, to be the most easily understood and simplest of the diagrams. So I will recreate it for you here. The pillars of this model, later known as domains, are institutional training, assignments, and self-development. Institutional training can be seen as anything that occurs in a traditional classroom. This might be required military training, such as basic combat training, or civilian degree programs, such as a bachelor's degree required to obtain the rank of captain as an Army officer. Assignments. Almost every expert would agree that the majority of leadership development occurs by the practice of leadership. Self-development. This is where leaders engage in lifelong learning far beyond the scope of what was required of them inside Army regulation or policy. This is learning to address personal weaknesses in terms of leadership abilities and gaining new and valuable information that can be applied on the battlefield to drive innovation. The Army Leadership Development Model was derived from years of experience in wartime operations, humanitarian operations, and military training. The Army Leadership Development Model allows for continuous leadership development, even in times of force reduction, restructuring, changes in Army doctrine and policy, and advancements with new battlefield technologies. With the publishing of the 2013 edition of this pamphlet, there were some slight modifications to the terms inside this model. Institutional training is simply referred to as institutional. Assignments is relabeled operational. While there are some slight changes to the names, the concepts remain the same. The graphical representations of this model from both the 1994 edition and the 2013 edition are presented here for you. As you can see, the 2013 edition is far more complex. However, if you look closely, the major domains of operational, institutional, and self-development remain consistent. What you see before you is the definition of self-development out of the DEA PAM 350-58. I believe this to be the best definition of self-development offered by the U.S. Army. It is unfortunate that this definition is not offered in other Army manuals, such as the FM 6-22 Leadership Manual. This creates difficulty in establishing a unified concept of self-development. While this definition provides good guidance on the theory of self-development, it lacks in practical guidance on how to put this theory into action to improve the warfighting ability of U.S. Army soldiers. Before we continue, let me give you two examples of self-developing individuals that had significant impact on the battlefield. The first example is General Patton. He was well known for his self-development techniques. It was said that he had read every book available in English on the topic of maneuver warfare. When he faced Rommel in the fields of North Africa, he had an advantage, having read Rommel's accounts of his own experiences in the First World War. The second example I have for you is retired Marine General and current Secretary of Defense James Mathis. This individual had significant impacts on both the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. He earned the nickname of the Warrior Monk, collecting a reading library of over 2,000 texts. He was well known in self-developing himself and providing valuable reading lists to his subordinate officers. These two individuals provide examples on how self-development can have significant impacts on every level of warfare, from tactical to strategic. Through practice self-learning, we can become better and learn how to dominate the modern battlefield. The problem with Army self-development. The concept is understood, but the application is not. We have a good theory, but the theory makes it very difficult to engage in practical application. The concept is not emphasized in Army producing programs. In the Army ROTC curriculum of 240 classroom hours, only 1 hour is dedicated to the topic of self-development. Operational demands. With the current long war, there is a constant demand which is drawing officers away from conducting self-development because time is so limited. There is a lack of assessment in self-development techniques. Self-development is not a recruitment criteria. We do not naturally recruit or have a criteria to recruit individuals into the Army that already have a demonstrated history of self-development prior to joining the military. Army self-development deviates from the civilian theory of self-directed learning that was developed by Malcolm Knowles. This means that Army leaders do not have direct access to volumes of civilian literature concerning how leaders improve their own leadership ability that's utilized every day in the civilian industry. The purpose of the study. There were 3 purposes to this study. The first was to define the concept of self-development as it applies to Army officer leader development. The second was to identify practical self-development techniques for each of the Army leader dimensions. The third was to suggest methods of integrating the discovered self-development techniques into the Army ROTC curriculum. Research questions. My research sought to answer 3 questions. The first, how is self-development defined within the scope of Army officer leader development, and how should it be defined? Second, what self-development techniques could be utilized to enhance Army leader dimensions? And finally, how can selected self-development techniques be integrated into the Army ROTC curriculum? The Delphi research method has a long-standing history with the United States military. First developed by Project RAND, it is a good technique to study topics that are not very well understood. Due to the fact that this was the first research that studied the topic of practical applications of self-development on the Army Leader Requirement Model, or the Army Leadership Dimensions, I purposely kept the retention standard for practical advice purposely low. I use a Likert scale throughout the study, ranging from 1, which is strongly disagree, to 5, representing strongly agree. Any practical research method that had a mean score of 3, a neutral score, was retained. It is my hope that future researchers continue these type of experiments to identify hundreds of more practical self-development techniques. Delphi panel requirements. For this study, I hope to find between 12 and 15 experts. To qualify as an expert in the study, individuals had to meet 2 requirements. First, they had to have the minimum rank of lieutenant colonel. Second, they had to have experience teaching at an officer producing program. This meant they had to be an instructor at either officer candidate school, the Reserve Officer Training Corps, or any of the various military academies. Finally, I hope to recruit participants from all three components of the United States Army, being active duty Army, the Army Reserve, and the Army National Guard. The Delphi panel. 36 officers were invited to participate. 13 signed consent forms and agreed to participate in the study. Demographic information was collected during the first survey iteration. 8 officers participated in that survey iteration. We know the following from the participants. There were 5 regular Army officers, 3 came from the National Guard. 3 were female, 5 were male, 5 were between the ages of 40 and 44, 2 were between the ages of 45 and 49, and 1 was between the age of 50 and 54. All participants were of the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. 6 had commissioned through the Army ROTC program, and 2 had commissioned through the Officer Candidate School. Retention rates. Due to the nature of the Delphi study requiring experts to review the opinions and data provided in previous surveys from other experts, the degrade and participation rate may have actually served as an advantage in this study. It allowed a smaller group of experts to agree and discuss very specific topics towards the end without becoming overwhelmed with data. Iteration number 1. In the survey iteration, expert panelists were asked to rate their opinion of the definition of self-development as it appears in the 2013 Department of Army pamphlet 350-58. The expert panelists were also asked to review and rate their opinion of the definition of self-directed learning by Malcolm Knowles. Then panelists were asked to provide a new definition of self-development as it specifically applies to junior Army officers. Participants were also asked to list any known self-development technique. Finally, experts were asked to provide practical self-development suggestions for each of the Army leadership dimensions. Survey iteration number 2 started by asking the research participants to rate the suggested clauses of a new definition of self-development as it applies to junior Army officers. This was done by utilizing the 5-point Likert scale previously explained. Text blocks was also provided for research participants so they could justify their responses or provide recommendations. Secondly, during this iteration, research participants rated the practical self-development techniques using the same 5-point Likert scale. Again, text blocks were provided so officers could provide recommendations for improvement or justify their rating. During survey iteration number 3, expert panelists were provided a list of the practical self-development techniques that had met the minimum retention standards of this study. Furthermore, they were provided the graphics of the Army ROTC Curriculum Plan, also known as the horse blanket for each semester of the Army ROTC program. The expert panelists were then asked how to integrate each of the practical self-development techniques into the ROTC curriculum. Iteration number 4. In the 4th survey iteration, the expert panelists were asked to rate the suggested ways of integrating the discovered practical self-development techniques into the Army ROTC program. Coding. There was a significant amount of text generated by the research participants of the study. In the end, it accounted for over 51 pages. The 3 tools shown on the screen were utilized to code the data during this research. Results for research question number 1. Definition of self-development specific to junior Army officers. Panelists provided a mean rating of 3.5 of the current definition of self-development that was in the current edition of the Army pamphlet 350-58. The research panelists questioned whether this definition was truly self-development and not some other aspect of leadership development because of the requirement to utilize the supervisor during the review and assessment process. Panelists provided a significantly higher mean rating of the definition of self-directed learning from Malcolm Knowles at 4.13. The only suggested change to this definition was the suggestion to add the clause that there needs to be a continual cycle of assessment and reassessment through self-directed learning. There were 32 suggested clauses for a new definition of self-development as it related to junior Army officers. All 32 clauses met the minimum retention standards throughout the course of the study. There was a significant trend in terms of 13 of these clauses, or 40.6%, related to the need for a continuous cycle of assessment and reassessment during self-development. The new definition was shaped by the following tenets. It was an individual officer's responsibility to engage in self-development. It requires a process of assessment and reassessment. There needs to be a plan created to address weaknesses and shortfalls. It could be enhanced by feedback through peers, subordinates, and superiors, and it was a continual, lifelong process. The definition of self-development specific to junior Army officers produced by this research is displayed on the next two slides. For your convenience, I've also included this information on the low bar below. You will note the mean Likert rating scores are displayed at the end of each clause. Results for research question number 2, practical self-development techniques. During the first survey iteration, research participants were asked to provide a list of known self-development techniques. Among the recommendations from the expert panelists that did not appear in other places in this research included techniques such as language training, cultural awareness training, watching TED Talks, utilizing virtual training, and utilizing the Junior Officer Development Support Form. Several of the techniques recommended from panelists have been recommended by other scholars, including things such as the 360-degree assessment, establishing goals, conducting book reviews, and journaling. The expert panelists recommended 107 different practical self-development techniques during the course of the study. Upon review, 39 of these techniques were removed from the study because they fell within the operational or institutional domain. With over 36% of the recommendations not actually being self-development, it raises the question, do our senior Army officers have a good understanding of self-development? The remaining 68 practical self-development techniques suggested in the study continued on, and all of them met the minimum required retention standards. The most debated subject was concerning the leadership dimension of sound judgment. There was significant debate of whether or not an individual needed to become a subject matter expert to have sound judgment. The topic of physical fitness was found to be the largest theme among the recommendations for practical self-development. It accounted for 10 of the 68 recommendations and was recommended for 4 separate leadership dimensions. Specificity. The specificity for the practical self-development techniques ranged dramatically. Some techniques were as short as a few words. Other techniques explained the intent of the activity and described the activity in detail. Approximately 20% of the suggested self-development techniques may require further revision so that they can be fully executed by junior Army officers. Lack of suggestions for every leadership dimension. This study failed to produce any practical self-development recommendation for the leadership dimensions of gets results and leads others. Results, research question number 3. Integration of the discovered techniques into the Army ROTC curriculum. It is unfortunate, but only one of the 4 panelists responded to this question as intended. The same occurrence happened during the pilot study, and the question was modified, hoping that it would not occur again in the final study. Further revision to this question may be required if the study is repeated. The participant that did respond as intended only provided recommendations for the first 2 academic years of Army ROTC. An additional practical self-development technique was suggested for cadets to have them produce and present an individual development plan at the beginning of every academic year. Implications, recommendations. This is the first research, to my knowledge, to attempt to produce practical self-development techniques for each of the Army leadership dimensions. Concerning research question number 1, the desire to add the emphasis for a continual cycle of assessment and reassessment echoes the language of the Army Training Leadership Development Panel of 2001. Concerning research question number 2, many of the suggested research techniques found within the study have been recommended by previous researchers and scholars. These techniques include the 360 assessment, book reviews, establishing goals, and journaling. Physical fitness. The emphasis on physical fitness within this domain of self-development may be caused by the worsening physical condition of American youth prior to their military service. Specificity of the suggested techniques. All the panelists within this study were of the rank of lieutenant colonel. While discussing with their peers, they may not have shared the detailed information on how to conduct self-development because it would have been largely understood within this community. However, providing instructions to junior Army officers on how to conduct self-development may require instructions being provided in much higher detail. It is my hope that future scholars would consider repeating this study to ensure that self-development techniques are recorded in sufficient enough detail that junior officers can engage with them as soon as they begin their military career. Lack of suggestions for all leadership dimensions. This may require re-examination of the Army leadership dimensions as understood by senior Army officers in comparison to the Army academic approaches to this model. Filtered results. The high number of suggestions for practical self-development techniques that had to be removed from this study because they did not fit within the scope of the self-development domain may cause us to question how the Army is approaching leadership dimensions. The Army has a continual focus of studying what good leaders do and what good leaders are. However, we have very little research and we dedicate very little time on how to become a good leader. The large number of self-development recommendations that had to be removed from this study may demonstrate that senior officers are having a difficulty of separating best practices and leadership suggestions from actual self-development techniques. Research question number 3. This study demonstrated that practical self-development techniques could be integrated within the Army ROTC curriculum. Future research is needed to further define practical self-development techniques and how they could be integrated throughout the Army ROTC curriculum. Recommendations. The expert panelists within this study recommended the definition of self-development be revised to emphasize that self-development is a self-driven practice. Furthermore, self-development needs to include a continual cycle of assessment and reassessment. It is recommended that ROTC cadets and junior Army officers be presented with a list of practical self-development techniques discovered by this research. These individuals can either adapt these techniques or use them to model other practical self-development techniques so they can begin the process of self-development early in their Army career. It is recommended that Cadet Command consider integrating the practical self-development techniques discovered within this research. Additionally, it is recommended to have cadets produce and present an individual development plan at the beginning of every academic year. Conclusion. Self-development is critical to enhance the performance of Army leaders on the modern battlefield. Therefore, we must dedicate resources to the study of both the theory and the practical application of self-development. The Army can ill afford to ignore the critical domain of self-development, given the role it plays in enhancing leadership at the tactical, operational, and strategic level. This research demonstrated that the Army theory of self-development could be translated into practical self-development techniques to enhance Army leadership. Continued research into practical self-development is critical to the United States Army to ensure that we can maintain national security and dominate the modern battlefield. Without further ado, here are the 68 practical self-development techniques discovered by this research. For further information and videos on the topic of self-development, please subscribe to The Evolving Warfighter.